Tell me the truth. Kunle, why is there no money in this house, yet my account just received 7 million naira?
Adesola, what are you talking about? Don't start imagining things.
Then who is for my baby rent and new phone meant for, if not your wife?
I had to ask for every naira just to buy food.
₦7 million.
I understand how horrible she has. It wasn't salary, it wasn't a gift.
It was money my husband sent to another woman.
Tice, I was never poor. And why? I was just living with someone who never saw my value.
She realized she wasn't poor. She had simply been living beside a man who never saw her value. Adesola didn't answer her husband right away. She simply placed the phone gently on the table, as if pressing it down any harder would shatter everything at once. Inside the small house tucked deep in an alley in Lagos, the old fan rattled loudly, blending with the faint smell of thin soup that hadn't been cleared away. Everything looked the same as every other day, except Adesola was no longer the same. Before, whenever Kunle raised his voice, she would fall silent. When he criticized her, she would lower her head. That was how she had been taught since childhood. A good woman endures, keeps the home peaceful, no matter the storm inside her. In this neighborhood, people didn't talk much about happiness. They talked about keeping your husband, holding your family together, and Adesola had believed that if she tried hard enough, everything would eventually be okay. But her version of okay was meals that were never enough. Counting every last coin to buy oil, to buy rice. The quiet shame of standing at a familiar stall, lowering her voice to say, "Please, let me owe you a few more days. My husband will pay." And every time, she kept her head down, because in Lagos, lacking money isn't just hardship, it's humiliation. Kunle was still sitting there, but something in his eyes began to shift. It wasn't the usual irritation anymore. It was something closer to unease. He glanced at the phone on the table, then back at his wife, as if trying to measure how much she knew. "Adesola, you misunderstood. That's company money," he said, his voice slower now, softer than usual. Adesola nodded slightly, so slightly that anyone not paying attention might think she agreed, but inside her, something had already moved. "I see," she said. No questions, no investigation. That calmness made Kunle uneasy. He was used to Adesola reacting, arguing, explaining, even crying. But today, she simply stood up, walked into the kitchen, and quietly finished clearing the unfinished meal. Every movement was slow, neat, almost routine. But the truth was, for the first time in years, Adesola was no longer trying to be understood. In her mind, fragments of memory began to fall into place. The times Kunle said, "I don't have money," yet came home in new clothes. The times he refused to support the family, yet rushed out with a smile whenever his phone rang. And those nights, when she lay facing the wall, asking herself what she had done wrong to become a wife who was not enough. Now, the answer was right in front of her. It wasn't that she wasn't enough. It was that she had given her value to the wrong person. That night, after Kunle had gone into the bedroom, Adesola remained alone in the living room. She opened the bank message again. The 7 million naira was still there, clear, cold, undeniable. For the first time, she didn't think about returning it, didn't think about explaining, didn't think about asking for permission. She asked herself just one simple question. If I keep living like this, who will I become in 5 years? There was no immediate answer, but it was enough to start something. Outside, Lagos was as loud as ever. the traffic, the voices, the street vendors calling out, all blending into a rhythm that never stopped. Life went on. But inside that small house, something had quietly ended. And something else had just begun. The next morning, Adesola woke up earlier than usual, not because she had slept better, but because she could no longer sleep the way she used to. The feeling inside her was no longer sadness or anger. It was like a thin layer of mist, cold, clear, and sharp enough to make everything stand out. She tied her jele neatly, put on her worn dress with frayed cuffs, and picked up her basket to go to the market. The familiar streets of Lagos were as crowded as ever, Danfo buses squeezing through traffic, people bargaining loudly, voices calling out from every direction. But Adesola walked more slowly today, not because she was tired, but because she was observing. Adesola, buying on credit again today? Mama Kemi's voice called out from her usual food stall. Adesola stopped. Just a brief moment, but long enough for her to realize that she used to lower her head in situations like this. She used to feel ashamed, small, indebted not just in money, but in dignity. Today, I'll just buy a little, she replied, her voice soft but steady. Mama Kemi looked at her, slightly surprised. Not because of what she said, but because of how she stood straight while saying it. No longer avoiding eye contact. Adesola bought a few simple things and left. For the first time in a long while, she didn't ask for credit. But the story didn't stop there. At the same time, in another part of the city, the upscale area of Lekki, where tall buildings reflected the morning sun, Zainab, 29, stood in front of a mirror, trying on a new dress. She adjusted her hair, smiled at her reflection, then picked up her phone. Kunle, I still haven't seen the money, she said, unable to hide her irritation. On the other end, Kunle sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had checked his account since last night. He knew exactly where the money had gone. I told you, I'm handling it. You need to be patient, he replied, trying to stay calm. Zainab let out a soft laugh, a laugh that no longer sounded sweet. Patient? Kunle, I don't live on promises. I need action. 7 million isn't a small amount, but for you, that shouldn't be a problem, right? Her words landed like an invisible slap. Kunle didn't answer right away. He stared out the window as traffic flowed like nothing had happened. But inside his mind, everything was starting to tangle. At home, he always said, I don't have money. But here, he had to prove that he did. 2 worlds, 2 roles. And now, they were colliding. I'll take care of it, Kunle said shortly before hanging up. But the moment the call ended, a sense of unease rose inside him. Not because of Zainab, but because of Adesola. He remembered the look in his wife's eyes the night before. No tears, no anger, just silence. A silence he couldn't understand. Meanwhile, Adesola had returned home. She set the basket down and began preparing breakfast. Everything went on as usual, cutting vegetables, boiling water, setting the table. But in her mind, small details were slowly connecting. Zainab, 7 million, for my baby. She didn't know who Zainab was, but she knew one thing for sure, that woman had never had to beg for money to buy food, had never been criticized for a meal that wasn't enough, had never had to prove her worth through silence. Adesola paused for a moment, staring at the pot of boiling water. A thought crossed her mind. Not anger, not revenge, just a simple question. But this time, she didn't avoid it. Why do I have to keep living as if I'm not enough? That question didn't change the house overnight. It didn't turn Kunle into a different man. It didn't erase the past. But it did something more important. It made Adesola begin to see herself again. And when a woman begins to recognize her own value, everything around her, sooner or later, must change with it. If you've ever been in a situation where someone made you feel like you were not enough, comment here. That afternoon, the Lagos sun softened a little. It was no longer as harsh as midday, but still hot enough to leave a quiet exhaustion in the air after a long day. Adesola sat in front of her house, the old plastic chair creaking softly as she shifted. In her hands was a small notebook, the one she hadn't opened in years. It used to hold her small business ideas, her simple dreams, a tiny fabric stall, a few beautiful Ankara patterns, a corner in the market where familiar customers could find her. But life had carried her away. Marriage, responsibilities, words spoken carelessly, yet heavy enough to make a woman slowly forget what she once wanted. Adesola? The familiar voice pulled her back. She looked up. Tunde, 40, her older brother, stood at the gate. He wasn't dressed in anything fancy. His shirt was slightly faded, his slippers simple, but his eyes were always clear, always honest. "You came without telling me," Adesola said, surprised. Tunde stepped in and sat across from her. He glanced around the house quickly, but enough to understand everything. "Are you okay?" he asked. Adesola was about to say "I'm fine," like she always did, but this time, the words stopped in her throat. She stayed silent for a few seconds, then shook her head. That was enough. Tunde understood. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but warm. "I just want to ask you one thing. Do you want to keep living like this?" That question was the same one Adesola had asked herself that morning. She looked down at the notebook in her hands, flipped to an old page, scribbled lines: "Sell Ankara fabrics, regular customers, wholesale prices." A part of her was still there. "I don't know where to start," she said softly. Tunde nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Start small," he said. "In Lagos, a woman can feed a whole family from just a small table in the market. Nobody says you have to be big from the beginning." He didn't give her money. He didn't make big promises. Just a simple, practical reminder from someone who had lived through real life. "You don't need anyone to save you, Adesola," he added. "You just need to stand up for yourself." The words weren't loud, not dramatic, but they stayed. That night, after Kunle came home, everything went on as usual. He ate, complained a little about the food, then buried himself in his phone. Adesola didn't react, didn't explain, didn't argue. It was just that she was no longer listening. The next morning, Adesola woke up early. She took a small portion of the 7 million naira, not much, just enough to begin. She went to the familiar market in Lagos, the same place where she once stood asking for credit. But today, she didn't come to ask. She came to buy. "Adesola?" Mama Kemi looked at her, surprised. "You're not buying food today?" Adesola smiled gently. "Today, I'm buying fabric." A simple sentence. But for her, it was the first step. She chose a few small Ankara bundles, not too expensive, not too many, just enough to try. When she paid, her hands trembled slightly, not because she was afraid of losing money, but because she was doing something she hadn't dared to do in years. Back home, she cleared a small space in front of the house, spread the fabric out, folded them neatly. No signboard, no advertisement, just a woman, starting again. Her first customers were neighbors. They looked, asked prices, some bought, some just watched. But every time someone stopped, Adesola felt a part of herself returning. That afternoon, Kunle came home earlier than usual. He stopped when he saw the fabrics displayed in front of the house. "What is this?" he asked, his tone displeased. "I'm selling fabric," Adesola replied calmly. Kunle frowned. "Who told you to do this? How much do you think you'll even make from this?" Before, those words might have silenced her, might have made her doubt herself. But today, she just looked at him. "I don't need to make a lot," she said. "I just need to stop asking." Silence filled the air for a few seconds. Kunle said nothing more, but his eyes had changed. No longer as certain as before. Something else had crept in, maybe irritation, or maybe the beginning of losing control. As for Adesola, she turned back to her fabrics. Her hands were still clumsy. Everything was still small. But this time, she no longer felt small. If you believe a woman can start over from the smallest steps, comment teen. 3 days after Adesola started selling fabrics in front of her house, life moved on in a strange way. Not loud, not dramatic, but something was clearly shifting. That afternoon, rain suddenly poured down in Lagos. Heavy drops hit the tin roof, creating a familiar, relentless rhythm. Adesola quickly gathered the fabrics inside, her hands moving fast but neatly. She had sold a few pieces. Not much money, but enough so she wouldn't have to ask Kunle for dinner that night. She had just placed the last bundle down when her phone vibrated. A bank notification. Adesola didn't open it immediately. Not because she didn't care, but because since that day, she had learned not to react too quickly to things. Still, she glanced at the screen. And this time, her heart beat faster. Plus 7 million naira. She stood still. No sharp breath. No words. Just staring at the number, as if blinking might make it disappear. Slowly, her hand opened the full message. For my baby. Rent and new phone. This wasn't a small mistake. Not a wrong digit. This was a mistake. Worth all the years she had stayed silent. The rain outside kept falling. But inside Adesola's mind, every sound seemed to fade away. Memories surfaced. The times she asked for money to buy rice and was refused. The times she cooked with too little and was criticized. The nights she lay facing the wall, wondering what she had done wrong to become a wife who was not worth investing in. And now, the answer was right in her hands. It wasn't that she wasn't enough. It was that she had never been his priority. Adesola slowly sat down on the plastic chair. The phone was still in her hand, its screen glowing in the dim, rainy room. She didn't cry. That surprised even her. A few months ago, she might have broken down, asked questions, wanted to know who the other woman was. But now, all of that was gone. In its place was a cold clarity. Somewhere else in the city, Kunle stood in front of an ATM, sweat forming on his forehead despite the rain. He had checked his transfer history 3 times. And the third time, the result hadn't changed. He had sent it to the wrong person. Not to Zainab, but to Adesola. I'm finished, he muttered under his breath. His phone vibrated. Zainab was calling. Kunle stared at the screen for a few seconds, then answered. I still haven't seen the money. Zainab's voice was colder now. Don't tell me you're joking. I'm working on it. There's a small technical issue, Kunle said quickly. Kunle, I don't care about your problems. I care about results. If I don't see that money today, don't bother calling me again. The call ended. Kunle stood still in front of the ATM. The people behind him began to grow impatient, but he didn't move, because in his mind right now, it wasn't Zainab. It was Adesola. He replayed the past few days. Her silence. The way she no longer argued. The way she looked at him, like a stranger. And for the first time, Kunle felt afraid. Not afraid of losing money, but afraid that he was no longer in control of the story. Meanwhile, Adesola remained in her small house. The rain had softened. Water dripped steadily from the roof, creating a quiet rhythm. She looked at the number on her screen again. 7 million naira. An amount that could change many things. But more importantly, it had changed the way she saw her life. Adesola took a deep breath. Then, she placed the phone down. No calls. No questions. No explanations. For the first time in years, she didn't react to someone else's mistake. She chose to observe. And sometimes, it is that silence that begins to make everything fall apart. The next morning, Lagos woke up as if nothing had happened. Danfo buses squeezed through the streets, people called out to one another, and an old radio played a familiar tune from a neighbor's house. Life went on as usual. Only Adesola was different. She woke early, folded the fabrics from the night before, then opened her phone. The 7 million naira was still sitting in her account. It hadn't disappeared. It wasn't a dream. She didn't rush to spend it, didn't rush to do anything at all. It was just that she no longer felt fear whenever she thought about money. Adesola took out a small portion, very small compared to the total. She carefully wrote it down in her old notebook. Buy more fabric, 120,000 naira. For the first time, numbers felt clear, controlled. No longer money she had to beg for, but money she decided how to use. She went to the market earlier than usual. The same streets of Lagos, the same familiar faces. But today, Adesola walked differently. No bowed head, no rushing. Adesola, you look different today, Mama Kemi said, curiosity in her eyes. Adesola simply smiled, no explanation. She chose fabrics more carefully, not just the cheapest ones, but the ones that could actually sell. Bright Ankara colors, patterns that followed current trends. She began to think like a businesswoman, no longer someone just trying to survive the day. That afternoon, in front of her house, the fabrics were arranged more neatly. A clean cloth laid underneath. A few customers lingered longer. Some asked for prices. Some came back for a second purchase. Adesola began to remember their names. A small change, but a sign of something bigger. Meanwhile, Kunle began to lose sleep. He came home earlier, but he was no longer at ease. His eyes kept drifting toward Adesola's phone, as if waiting for something to happen. So, how's business lately? He asked, trying to sound casual. It's okay, Adesola replied briefly. No follow-up, no extra detail. That lack of reaction irritated Kunle. He didn't understand. Why wasn't she asking about the money? Why wasn't she confronting him? Why wasn't she making a scene like he had prepared himself for? But Adesola understood something very clearly. Not every truth needs to be spoken immediately. Sometimes, letting someone face their own mistake is what makes them truly realize it. In another part of the city, Zainab was no longer patient. Kunle, who do you think I am? Her voice cut sharply through the phone. It's been 3 days. 7 million naira is not a joke. I told you, there's an issue. I'm working on it. I don't need excuses. I need results. A brief silence. Then Zainab spoke again, slower this time. Honestly, I'm not even sure I need you anymore. Those words landed like a blade. Kunle stood still, phone in hand. For the first time, he felt like he was no longer in control. Before, he decided who received money, who had to wait, who had to ask. But now, everything had reversed. He didn't know what Adesola would do. He couldn't hold on to Zainab. And for the first time, he didn't know where he stood. That night, when Kunle returned home, he paused at the front. The fabrics were arranged neatly. A few customers were still browsing. Adesola stood there, speaking to them, her voice calm, clear. She was no longer the silent woman standing behind him. She was standing in her own place. Kunle watched for a few seconds. A strange feeling rose inside him. Not pride, not exactly anger, but a fear he couldn't quite name. The fear that the woman who once depended on him no longer needed him at all. Inside, Adesola finished cleaning up. She sat down, opened her notebook, and wrote a few more lines. No grand plans, no distant dreams, just small steps, but steady ones. And this time, every step was her choice. That night, the small house was quieter than usual. No complaints about the food, no loud television trying to fill the empty space, just the faint buzzing of mosquitoes and a tension no one spoke about. Kunle sat at the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together. His phone lay beside him, the screen lighting up and going dark again, unanswered messages from Zainab still there. But this time, he wasn't in a hurry to reply. He was thinking about Adesola, the woman who was still in this house, yet somehow had already stepped out of his life. Adesola, he called, his voice lower than usual. She was in the living room, writing something in her small notebook. She didn't answer right away. Only after a few seconds did she look up. Is something wrong? She asked. Her voice was calm, too calm. Kunle stepped out and stood in front of her. He had planned to circle around the truth like he had done in the past, to ask gently, to protect his pride. But then, he stopped. There are moments when you realize you can't keep pretending anymore. I sent the money to the wrong account, Kunle said, avoiding her eyes. Adesola wasn't surprised. She simply nodded slightly, as if she had known all along. 7 million naira, he continued, this time more quickly. I need you to send it back. Urgently. No explanation. No apology. Just a demand. Adesola put her pen down, looked at him. There was no sadness in her eyes, no anger, just clarity. You need it? She asked softly. Kunle began to lose patience. That money isn't yours, Adesola. It's money I was supposed to send to. He stopped. The words got stuck in his throat. Adesola didn't rescue him, didn't ask further. She just waited. And that silence forced him to face his own truth. I needed to handle some business. Kunle corrected himself. Adesola smiled faintly. A very slight smile, but enough to irritate him. What kind of business needs 7 million? With the note, for my baby, she asked. No raised voice, no sarcasm. Just a question. Precise enough. The air in the room grew heavy. Kunle didn't answer. For the first time, he had no excuse. Adesola stood up. Not in a hurry. Not trembling. She stepped a little closer, not to confront, but to make things clear. Do you know what hurts me the most? She asked. Kunle remained silent. It's not the money. It's not even that woman, she continued. It's the fact that you made me believe we had nothing. Pause. I thought we were truly struggling. I blamed myself for not managing well enough. I tried to live on 3,000 naira and told myself that was normal. Her voice stayed steady, but every word touched the place Kunle didn't want to face. Meanwhile, you could send 7 million to someone else without hesitation. Kunle turned his face away. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Not used to being forced to look at the truth. Adesola, I told you I'll explain later. Right now, you just need to. No, she cut in. For the first time, she interrupted him. Not loudly, but firmly. Not now. Not later. I don't need your explanation anymore. Those words made Kunle freeze. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. The woman standing in front of him was no longer the one trying to earn his approval. She stood straight, calm, and distant. So what are you going to do with the money? He asked, his voice lower. Adesola didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the notebook on the table. The small numbers, the small plans. Then she looked back at him. I'll use it to live a life where I don't have to ask for permission to exist. The sentence wasn't loud, but it was enough to end something. Kunle said nothing more. He understood, even if he hadn't accepted it yet. That night, he lay with his back turned to Adesola, his eyes open, but sleep wouldn't come. In his mind, everything replayed. Zainab, 7 million, Adesola's words, and a thought he had never had before. Maybe he had lost her a long time ago, not because of today's mistake, but because of everything he had done for years. As for Adesola, she stayed a little longer in the living room, not overthinking, just, for the first time, she felt like she was living her own life. In the days that followed, Kunle was no longer the same man, not because of a promise, but because for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to hold on to except his own family. He started with the smallest things. Early in the morning, he woke up before Adesola, quietly sweeping the front yard. In the evenings, he sat beside her as she sewed fabrics, saying little, just helping her fold the pieces. No more complaints, no more looks of contempt, just clumsy, quiet effort. Adesola saw everything, but she didn't react right away, because this time, she didn't need an apology. She needed change. One evening, as they sat across from each other after dinner, Kunle finally spoke. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away," he said, his voice low and slow. "I just want a chance to do it right. Not like before, but better." Adesola stayed silent for a few seconds. She looked at the man in front of her, the one who had hurt her deeply, but who was now trying, day by day, to change. "I'm not going back to who I used to be," she said. "But if you truly want to rebuild, then we start from the beginning. Not immediate forgiveness, not pretending nothing ever happened, but a new beginning, more real, more mature." A few months later, that small corner in front of the house was no longer just a few pieces of fabric. It had become a small shop. Regular customers started coming back. Adesola no longer had to ask for money just to survive. She stood there, in her own worth, and Kunle was no longer standing in front of her. He stood beside her, not as someone who gives, but as someone who finally learned how to value what he had. Adesola didn't change because of money. She changed the moment she realized her value was never in someone else's hands. She didn't need to shout to prove she was right. She only needed to stop accepting what she did not deserve. And Kunle learned a lesson many men realized too late, that you can have money, power, choices, but if you don't value your family, one day you may find yourself alone with everything you've lost. In the end, a woman's true strength is not in how much she endures, but in knowing when to stop and choose herself again. If you believe respect is the foundation of every relationship, comment tin. And where are you watching this story from? Leave your city in the comments. Wishing you the strength to love and the wisdom to never lose yourself in the process.